The dumpster was 8 feet wide. That's wider than most bedrooms in a St. Louis efficiency apartment. Wider than the hallway in the house Jolene Thibodeau lost 11 months ago. Wider than the hospital bed where her husband Marcus died on a Tuesday in March, with his boots still on because he'd been trying to get dressed when his heart quit. 8 feet wide, 22 feet long. And nobody wanted it. That's the part of this story that won't leave me alone. Not the poverty. Not the grief. The geometry. Because Jolene didn't just crawl into some trash can behind a Wendy's and curl up. She found something the size of a single-car garage, abandoned behind a half-built apartment complex on Natural Bridge Avenue. And she turned it into the most functional living space on a street where the actual apartments had black mold and no running water. She fit a bed in there. A real bed. A twin mattress she pulled from somebody's alley pile off Goodfellow Boulevard, still wrapped in plastic from the factory. And next to it, with room to spare, she set up a 2-burner Coleman camp stove on a piece of plywood balanced across 2 cinder blocks. A bed and a stove, side by side, inside a dumpster. And here's what nobody at the day shelter on 14th Street could figure out when she first told them about it. Why was she warmer than they were? We'll get to that. Jolene was 51 years old, and she'd never missed a rent payment in her life until August of 2023. That was 5 months after Marcus. 5 months of trying to hold together a 2-income household on 0 incomes. Because Jolene had quit her housekeeping job at the airport Marriott to take care of him during chemo, and then he died anyway. And the Marriott had already filled her position with a girl named Destiny, who was 23 and didn't need FMLA. The house on Bircher Boulevard wasn't theirs. They'd rented it for 9 years from a guy named Kendrick, who owned 4 properties in Penrose and maintained exactly none of them. When Jolene fell behind, Kendrick didn't send a warning letter. He sent his cousin with a padlock on a Thursday afternoon while she was at the food bank. She came back to a chain on her own front door. Her clothes were in garbage bags on the porch. The padlock was brass-colored and still had the price sticker on it from Home Depot. $11.47. That's what it cost to erase 9 years. She stayed with her sister Monique in Florissant for 6 weeks, but Monique had 4 kids in a 2-bedroom duplex and a boyfriend named Deshaun, who made it clear every single night that Jolene's air mattress in the living room was a problem. Not by saying anything, by turning the TV up louder every time she tried to sleep, by leaving the front door open in October so the cold would push in and she'd have to get up and close it, by eating the food she bought and putting the empty containers back on her shelf in the fridge. Jolene left on a Saturday morning before anyone woke up. She took 2 garbage bags of clothes and Marcus's old Coleman stove, the one he used to bring on fishing trips to the Current River before he got sick. She didn't know why she grabbed the stove. She told herself it was practical. But it was the last thing his hands had touched that wasn't a hospital blanket, and she couldn't leave it in Monique's garage next to Deshaun's weight bench. Her first night outdoors was November 4th, 2023. She slept behind a laundromat on West Florissant with her back against the dryer vent, which pushed warm air through a gap in the aluminum siding. She didn't sleep. She stared at the parking lot and listened to a dog bark somewhere near the railroad tracks, and thought about how Marcus used to complain about the mattress at home being too soft, and how she told him to stop being dramatic, and how she'd give anything now to hear him complain about one more thing. The shelter system in St. Louis works like this. You show up, you wait, you hope. Beds fill by early afternoon most days during cold months. The big facility on 14th Street can hold maybe a few hundred people. The churches rotate availability on different nights. You can't always get in, and if you do get in, you're out by 6 a.m. no matter what the temperature is outside, carrying everything you own. Jolene tried the shelters for about 3 weeks. What she found was that she spent more energy getting into a bed every night than she would have spent just finding her own spot and staying there. The lines, the intake paperwork, the guy who stole her shoes while she was in the bathroom and she had to walk to the Salvation Army in socks on a 28-degree morning to get a replacement pair that were 2 sizes too big. She gave up on the system around Thanksgiving, moved to a tent camp under the overpass near Cass Avenue, the one by the railroad trestle. There were about 15 people there. She didn't know any of them. A woman named Phyllis, who was maybe 60, maybe 70, hard to tell, gave her a tarp and showed her how to weight the corners with chunks of broken concrete so the wind wouldn't rip it off at 3 in the morning. Phyllis had a shopping cart system. 3 carts, each one organized for a different purpose. One for clothes and bedding, one for food and water, one for house stuff, which was duct tape, bungee cords, a hammer, zip ties, a flashlight, and a stack of those silver Mylar emergency blankets you can buy at any gas station for $2. Jolene watched Phyllis. She watched how Phyllis layered the Mylar blankets inside the tarp to bounce body heat back. She watched how Phyllis hung a windbreak made of flattened cardboard boxes across the north side of her spot, angled so rain would slide off instead of pooling. Phyllis had been outside for 4 years. She knew things that nobody teaches and nobody writes down, and you can only learn by standing in the wind long enough to figure out where it comes from. But the camp got swept on December 11th. City crew showed up with a dump truck and 2 cops and a woman in a puffy jacket with a clipboard who told everybody they had 60 minutes to relocate. The woman said there was a warming center open on Jefferson. Phyllis laughed at that. She said the warming center had plastic chairs and fluorescent lights, and you couldn't close your eyes without somebody going through your pockets. Phyllis went north. Jolene went south. They didn't exchange numbers because neither of them had a working phone. The apartment complex on Natural Bridge Avenue had been dead for almost 2 years by the time Jolene walked past it in mid-December. 3 buildings. Brick. 2 stories each. 12 units per building. The developer had gotten the framing up on 2 of the 3 buildings, put windows in one of them, and then vanished. Ran out of money, or got sued, or both. The construction fence was still standing, but somebody had clipped the chain on the gate months ago and it swung open with the weight of a hand. Behind the farthest building, the one that was just a skeleton of studs and Tyvek wrap, Jolene found the dumpster. It wasn't the kind she'd been sleeping near at gas stations and behind restaurants. Those were the green or brown ones with the flip lids, the ones the garbage trucks grab with the forklift arms, 6 feet long maybe. Enough room to curl up in, but not enough to stretch out. And they stank and they got emptied every week, which meant you had to clear out or get crushed. This was different. This was a roll-off, a construction dumpster, the kind they drop off a flatbed truck using a hydraulic arm and a cable system, and then they just leave it for weeks, months, however long the job takes. And when the job dies, like this one had, the dumpster stays. Because somebody owes somebody else money and nobody's paying to have it hauled away. And it just sits there getting rained on. It was dark blue. The paint was faded and peeling along the top rail. The company logo on the side was some outfit called Metro Roll-Off Services, with a phone number that probably went to a disconnected line. One corner had a dent where something heavy had been dropped into it by a loader. The rear had a double door, like barn doors, that swung outward on piano hinges and latched with a cam lock. Jolene walked up to it. The cam lock wasn't locked. She pulled the handle and the right side door groaned open, and she looked inside. Empty. Completely empty. The contractor had cleaned it out before he disappeared, or maybe the scrappers had already been through and taken anything worth selling. The floor was bare steel with a rust-colored film of dried rainwater. The walls went straight up, corrugated, about 6 feet tall on the outside, but the floor was recessed below the bottom rail, so the interior height was closer to 6.5 feet. She could stand up in there without ducking, and it was wide. That's the part that stopped her. She'd seen roll-off dumpsters before, lined up in the parking lots at Home Depot or behind new construction. She'd walked past them 100 times, but she'd never stood inside one. She'd never felt the space. She put her arms out. She couldn't touch both walls, not even close. Her fingertips were about a foot short on each side. She paced the length. Took her about 8 normal steps to get from the rear doors to the front wall. 22 feet, give or take. She didn't have a tape measure. She didn't need one. She could see it. A bed could go against the left wall. A cooking area could go on the right. And there'd still be room to walk between them. She stood in that empty steel box for probably 10 minutes, doing nothing but looking at the walls and the floor and the open sky above her. Because roll-offs don't have a roof. They're open on top. And she thought about Marcus and his Coleman stove, and the fishing trips, and the way he used to set up camp in 30 minutes flat, Everything organized, everything in its place. Because Marcus had been in the army for 6 years, and he believed that order was the difference between comfort and misery. She pulled the doors closed behind her. Not all the way. Left them cracked about 6 inches so she could get out fast if she needed to. Then she sat down on the steel floor with her back against the wall and she listened. No traffic noise from Natural Bridge. The building blocked it. No foot traffic. Nobody walking dogs. Nobody selling anything. Just the wind going over the top of the dumpster and making a low humming sound against the corrugated walls, like blowing across the mouth of a bottle. She spent that first night on the bare steel floor with a sleeping bag and 2 mylar blankets. It was cold. The steel sucked the heat out of her body anywhere it touched, and by 2 a.m. she was shivering hard enough that her teeth chattered and she had to get up and pace the length of the dumpster just to warm up. But she came back the next night, and the night after that. The bed came first. She found the mattress 3 days later, leaning against a telephone pole on Goodfellow, behind a house where somebody was clearly moving out. It was still in the original plastic, twin size, 38 inches wide. She dragged it 14 blocks to Natural Bridge, which took her 2 hours because she had to stop every few minutes and re-grip the plastic. Her hands were raw and red by the time she got it through the fence and wrestled it through the barn doors. She laid it along the left wall. It fit with about 4.5 feet of space between the edge of the mattress and the right wall. She stood in that gap and looked at it and thought, that's more room than Marcus's hospital had between his bed and the wall. But the mattress on bare steel was still cold. The metal underneath pulled heat through the bottom of the mattress like a drain. She needed something between the two. Cardboard helped a little, but it compressed flat after one night, and then it was basically nothing. She found the foam board at the construction site itself. 3 sheets of pink rigid insulation each, 1 4 feet by 8 feet, leaning against the unfinished building where the contractor had left them. She didn't know the technical name. She called them the pink boards. She laid 2 of them flat on the steel floor where the mattress would go, overlapping the seams, and then put the mattress on top. First night on the foam and mattress, she slept 5 hours straight, the longest she'd slept since Marcus died. The foam kept the cold from coming up through the floor. The mattress was soft enough that her hips didn't ache. She woke up at 4 a.m. not because she was cold, but because a raccoon was scratching at the barn doors, and she kicked the steel wall and it ran. The stove setup took longer. She had Marcus's Coleman, a 2-burner propane camp stove, the green one with the fold-out windscreens. He'd bought it at Bass Pro in 2019. It ran on those little green propane canisters, the ones that cost about $4 each and last maybe 3 hours on low. She didn't set it up on the floor. She'd seen what happens when you cook on an uneven surface. The pot slides, the grease spills, the flame catches something. She found 2 cinder blocks in the rubble behind the unfinished building, and a piece of 3/4-inch plywood that somebody had cut into a rectangle, maybe 2 feet by 3 feet. She stacked the cinder blocks on the right side of the dumpster, about 8 feet from the rear doors, and laid the plywood across the top. Level, stable, high enough that she could stand and cook without bending over. She set the Coleman on the plywood, opened the windscreens, hooked up a propane canister, turned the knob. The igniter clicked 3 times before it caught. And then there was a blue flame and the smell of propane burning clean, and she stood there in a dumpster behind a failed apartment complex on Natural Bridge Avenue, and she cried, because the last time she'd smelled that was at Indian Creek, September of 2018, and Marcus had been grilling catfish he'd caught that morning and telling her the same story about his drill sergeant that he'd already told her 40 times. She boiled water that first night, made instant coffee in a styrofoam cup, drank it standing next to her bed in her dumpster, with the barn doors cracked open and the steam rising out the top into the December sky. She had a bed, and she had a stove, and she had walls, and she had a door that latched. It wasn't a home. She never called it that. She called it the box. But the box had more usable space than any shelter cot, more privacy than any tent, and more protection from the wind than any overpass. She spent the next few weeks solving problems, one at a time, like Marcus would have done, systematic, patient. The open top was the biggest problem. Rain came straight in. Snow too. The first hard rain soaked the mattress, and she had to drag it out and lean it against the building to dry for 2 days, sleeping on the pink boards with a trash bag over her hips. She fixed it with a blue poly tarp from the Dollar General on Riverview, 8 by 10 feet. She stretched it across the top of the dumpster and tied it down to the top rail with bungee cords, which she scavenged from the back of a U-Haul truck parked at a storage facility on Goodfellow. The tarp sagged in the middle when it rained, which collected water, which made it sag more, which eventually dumped a gallon of water onto the floor at 2 in the morning, like somebody had turned on a faucet. She fixed that by putting a broomstick under the tarp at the center, propped between the 2 walls, so the tarp tented up and water rolled off the edges instead of pooling. The rear doors leaked, not through the doors themselves, but through the gap where the rubber gasket should have been. The gasket was shredded, hanging in strips, and wind whistled through the gap like a broken whistle. She stuffed the gap with strips of an old towel and then taped over it with aluminum HVAC tape she found in a box of supplies at the construction site. 3 layers. It stopped the whistle and cut the draft to almost nothing. The condensation was the problem she didn't expect. On cold mornings, the inside of the steel walls would be coated with water droplets, sometimes frost. Her breath was doing it. All night she exhaled warm, moist air into a cold steel box, and the moisture collected on the coldest surface, which was the walls. By morning the walls would be dripping, and the drips would run down and pool along the base of the walls and soak anything that was touching them. She moved the mattress away from the wall, left a 3-inch gap, put a row of folded newspaper in the gap to absorb the drips, changed the newspaper every couple days. Then she got the idea to line the walls with the leftover pink foam board. She broke the 3rd sheet into pieces and wedged them vertically against the walls on either side of the bed and behind the stove area. The foam wasn't touching the steel at every point, which meant there were air gaps behind it, and those air gaps acted like insulation. The condensation still happened, but it happened on the steel side of the foam, not the room side. The interior stayed drier, not dry, drier. By January she had a routine. Up at 5:30 before the light came. Check the tarp for ice, crack the barn doors and look both ways to make sure nobody was in the lot. Boil water for coffee and oatmeal on the Coleman. Eat sitting on the bed. Pack the day bag, water bottle, phone charger cord. She had no phone, but she kept the cord because she was going to get one eventually. Granola bars, Idaho, social security card in a Ziploc bag. A change of socks. Walk to the day center on 14th Street. Shower if there was time and no line. Check the job board. Fill the water bottles. Charge the power bank if somebody had a working outlet near a chair. Walk to the library on Olive Street and sit in a chair that didn't move and read whatever was on the hold shelf, and pretend for 2 hours that she lived somewhere with an address. Back to the box by 4 p.m., before dark. Cook whatever she had. Rice. Canned beans. Sometimes a piece of chicken from the marked-down shelf at the Save-A-Lot on Natural Bridge, when she had cash from the day labor agency on Cass. She kept the exterior looking abandoned. That was the rule she never broke. The outside of the dumpster had to look like a dumpster. Not a home. Not occupied. Not interesting. She left a few pieces of broken lumber on top of the tarp so from a distance it looked like debris, not a roof. She never hung anything to dry on the outside. Never left shoes by the door. Never stacked anything visible. Inside was different. She organized it the way Marcus would have. Bed on the left, tight and squared. Stove station on the right, propane canisters lined up by the wall. A milk crate for a nightstand with a battery-powered lantern and a paperback book and a framed picture of Marcus in his army dress uniform that she'd grabbed from the house on Bircher before Kendrick's cousin changed the locks. She kept the picture in a gallon Ziploc to protect it from the moisture. A woman at the day center named Carla asked her once where she was staying. Jolene said behind Natural Bridge. Carla asked if she was in a tent. Jolene said no. She had something better. Carla pressed. Jolene told her about the dumpster. Carla looked at her like she'd lost her mind. Girl, you're sleeping in a dumpster? Jolene said she wasn't sleeping in a dumpster. She was living in a steel room that happened to have been built for a different purpose. Carla didn't see the difference. Jolene didn't expect her to. The first real test came on January 14, 2024, St. Louis dropped to 6 degrees that night. Wind chill was below zero. The city opened emergency warming centers. Shelters went to overflow capacity. 2 men were found unresponsive in a parking structure downtown. One of them didn't make it. Jolene stayed in the box. She'd been preparing for this. She had 3 Mylar blankets layered under the sleeping bag. She had the foam board on the floor and walls. She had the tarp tied tight and the broomstick holding it up. She sealed the barn doors from the inside with extra tape and stuffed the bottom gap with a rolled towel. The Coleman was a risk, and she knew it. Propane burns clean, but it still eats oxygen. You can't run it in a sealed space. She left one corner of the tarp unfastened so air could move, just barely, enough to keep from suffocating but not enough to lose all the heat. She ran the stove on the lowest setting, not to cook, just for the heat. The blue flame was almost invisible in the dark. It hissed softly. She lay on the mattress in her sleeping bag with the Mylar crackling every time she moved. And she watched the flame. And she listened to the wind going over the top of the dumpster. And she thought about how strange it was that the coldest night of the year felt less dangerous than the first night she'd spent behind the laundromat on West Florasson. Because now she had walls and a door and a bed and a flame. She was not warm. She wants to be clear about that, she told the woman from the outreach team weeks later. She was never warm. What she was not dying. There's a gap between those two things that most people never have to think about, and she lived in that gap for the whole winter. Morning came. She was stiff, and her knees ached, and the tarp had a half-inch of ice on it. But she got up, made coffee, ate oatmeal, walked to the day center. 2 nights later it was 11 degrees and she did the same thing, and the night after that, and the night after that. Word got around. Not fast. Jolene wasn't advertising, but people at the day center talk, and Carla told somebody and that person told somebody else, and by February there were 2 other women who asked if they could see the dumpster. Not to move in, just to see. Jolene brought them, a woman named Gina, maybe 45, who'd been sleeping in her car until the car got towed, and an older woman everybody called Auntie V, who was at least 65 and had been outside for longer than she was willing to count. They walked through the clipped fence and across the lot, and Jolene pulled open the barn doors and Gina said, "This is not a dumpster." Jolene said, "Yeah, it is." She looked at the bed. She looked at the stove. She looked at the foam on the walls and the tarp overhead and the milk crate nightstand with Marcus's picture in the Ziploc bag. She looked at the 3-inch gap between the mattress and the foam-lined wall where the folded newspaper caught the drips. "This is an apartment," Gina said. "You built an apartment in a dumpster." Auntie V didn't say anything. She just stood inside the barn doors with her arms crossed and nodded slowly, the way you nod when you see somebody else figured out the thing you spent years circling around. Then Auntie V asked the question that mattered. "How do you know the truck's not coming?" That was the fear. The only real fear. Not the cold, not the rain, not the cops. The truck. Because roll-off dumpsters get picked up. A truck shows up with a cable and a hydraulic arm, and it drags the whole container onto the flatbed, and it drives it to the transfer station and dumps everything inside into a compactor. And if you're in there when it happens, you die. People die in dumpsters every year in this country, more than most people know about, because it only makes the local news for one cycle and then everyone forgets. Jolene had thought about this. She'd thought about it the first night and every night since. Her answer was not complicated. The contractor was gone. The hauling company was either out of business or had written the container off. Nobody had touched this dumpster in at least a year before she found it, based on the rust and the weeds growing through the wheels. But she wasn't stupid about it. She never latched the barn doors from inside. She kept them cracked. She kept her shoes on until she was in the sleeping bag. And every morning the first thing she did before anything else was look for tire tracks in the gravel that weren't hers. She told Auntie V, "If the truck comes, I'll hear it. Those things run on diesel. You can hear a diesel engine from a block away." Auntie V said, "And if you're asleep," because there wasn't a good answer. She knew it, and Auntie V knew it, and they both let the question sit there on the steel floor between them, like a wet towel nobody wanted to pick up. March brought rain. Days of it. The tarp held, but the ground around the dumpster turned to mud, and the water ran under the barn doors and puddled on the floor near the entrance. She built a dam out of a rolled tarp and a piece of 2x4 wedged across the bottom of the door frame. It worked most of the time. During the heavy rains, some water still got in, and she'd wake up to a 1/4 inch of standing water that she'd push out with a piece of cardboard she used as a squeegee. She lost a pair of shoes to the water, left them on the floor near the door instead of on the milk crate, and by morning they were soaked through. She dried them on the stove grid, which took most of a propane canister, and left the shoes stiff and cracked. She got another pair from the donation bin at the Baptist church on Newstead. The bigger problem was the propane. Each canister gave her about 3 hours on low. She was using 1 canister every 2 nights for heat, plus maybe 1/3 of a canister per day for cooking. That's roughly 2.5 canisters per day when it was really cold, maybe 1.5 when it wasn't. At $4 each, she was spending $40 to $50 a week just on propane. The day labor agency paid $10 an hour when there was work, which wasn't every day. Some weeks she only got 2 or 3 shifts. The math didn't work. She started rationing, cooked 1 meal a day instead of 2, used the stove for heat only on the worst nights, wore every layer she owned to bed on the other nights, got a second sleeping bag from the Salvation Army drop, and put one inside the other like a nesting doll. By April, the cold broke enough that she could go nights without the stove. And by then she'd figured out that the dumpster's steel walls, which had been her enemy all winter because they sucked heat out, actually worked in her favor as spring arrived. On sunny days, the steel absorbed heat, and the interior of the dumpster got warm, warmer than outside, warm enough that she'd come home at 4 p.m., and the air inside would feel like a car that had been sitting in a parking lot with the windows up. Not hot, but warm. Noticeably, surprisingly warm. She hadn't expected that. She hadn't planned for it. It just happened, and it made her think about Marcus again, about how he used to say that everything has a season where it's working for you and a season where it's working against you. And the trick is knowing which season you're in. The outreach team found her in May. 2 women from an organization working with the city's homeless services office. They'd heard about her from somebody at the day center. They came to the lot on a Tuesday afternoon and knocked on the barn door like it was a front door, which Jolene appreciated because it meant they were treating it like a home, even if the city wouldn't. They asked her questions: how long she'd been there, whether she felt safe, whether she had any health conditions, whether she wanted help finding permanent housing. Jolene said yes. To the housing part, she said she'd been saying yes for 8 months. The problem was that the wait list for a housing voucher in the city was running 2 years or more, and she didn't have a mailing address to receive the paperwork, and she didn't have a phone to get the callback, and every time she went to the office on Delmar to follow up, they told her to wait for the letter that was going to a house she didn't live in anymore. One of the outreach workers, a woman named Danielle who was maybe 30, looked around the interior of the dumpster and said, "You did all this yourself?" Danielle said, "This is better than some of the apartments I've inspected." Jolene didn't laugh at that. She wanted to, but she didn't because it wasn't really funny. It was the truth, and the truth of it was the ugly part, that a widow sleeping in a construction dumpster behind a bankrupt building site had built herself a better living space than what the housing market was offering to people who could actually pay rent. The pink foam she used cost nothing because it was abandoned. The tarp cost $6. The bungee cords were free. The mattress was free. The stove was Marcus's. The whole setup cost less than 1 night in a motel, and it had lasted 5 months. Danielle gave her a phone, a government-issue smartphone through a program Jolene had never heard of, and she gave her a mailing address, care of the outreach organization, where the housing paperwork could go, and she said she'd check back in 2 weeks. Jolene put the phone in the Ziploc bag and set it on the milk crate next to Marcus's picture. She stayed in the dumpster through the summer. It got hot, really hot. St. Louis in July is a different kind of misery. The steel walls that had been too cold in January were too hot in July, and the interior of the dumpster at 3 p.m. on a 95-degree day was an oven. She'd leave the barn doors wide open and pull the tarp back to let air through, but the floor stayed hot enough that she could feel it through her shoes. She started sleeping with the doors open and a piece of hardware cloth across the opening to keep animals out. She found the hardware cloth at the construction site, a 4-foot roll of it, and she cut it with a pair of tin snips she borrowed from a man named Gerald, who lived in a van on the next block over. Gerald was 60-something, a retired electrician who'd lost his pension in a divorce and then lost his apartment when his disability payments got garnished. He didn't ask why she needed tin snips. He just handed them over and said, "Bring them back." She brought them back the next morning and also brought him a plate of rice and beans she'd cooked on the Coleman. Gerald ate it sitting in the driver's seat of his van, with the door open and his feet on the asphalt, and he said it was the best thing he'd eaten in a month. They became friends. Not the kind of friends who tell each other everything. The kind of friends who check on each other without being asked. Gerald would walk past the lot on Natural Bridge every few days and look at the dumpster from the sidewalk. If the barn doors were cracked and the tarp was up, he kept walking. If the doors were closed all the way, he'd come in and knock. That was the system. No conversation needed. One time in August, Jolene got sick. Some kind of stomach thing, probably from bad water or bad food. She wasn't sure. She was in the dumpster for 2 days straight. Gerald knocked on the second day, and she didn't answer, so he opened the door and found her on the mattress, dehydrated, unable to stand up without the room spinning. He brought her water from the gas station on Natural Bridge, Gatorade, crackers. He sat in the doorway of the dumpster with his back against the frame, and he didn't leave until she'd eaten something, and the color came back to her face. When she could talk again, she said, "You didn't have to do that." And Gerald said, "Yeah, I did." The housing paperwork came through in October, 10 months after she'd moved into the dumpster. Danielle from the outreach team called her on the government phone and said there was a 1-bedroom unit available through a transitional housing program on South Grand. Subsidized rent. Utilities included. Move in within 2 weeks. Jolene stood in the dumpster when she got the call. She was standing between the bed and the stove, in the gap that she'd walked through 1,000 times, the 4.5-foot wide lane that was her hallway and her kitchen and her living room and her world. She said yes. Obviously, she said yes. She moved out on a Thursday. She rolled up the sleeping bags. She took the Coleman stove and the lantern and the milk crate and Marcus's picture in the Ziploc. She pulled the foam boards off the walls and stacked them in a corner in case somebody else needed them. She unclipped the bungee cords and folded the tarp. She left the mattress. Whoever came next might need it. The apartment on South Grand had a door with a deadbolt and a window with a curtain, and a bathroom with hot water and a kitchen with an electric stove, and a bedroom with a closet and carpet. It was 600 square feet. She walked through it in 20 seconds. It felt enormous. It felt like the inside of a cathedral after a year of living in a box. She unpacked Marcus's picture first, took it out of the Ziploc, set it on the kitchen counter because she didn't have a nightstand yet, looked at him in his army dress uniform, 30 years old, shoulders back, eyes straight ahead, and she said, "We got an address, baby." Then she put the Coleman stove under the kitchen sink. She didn't need it anymore, but she kept it where she could see it. Jolene goes back to Natural Bridge sometimes, not often. The dumpster is still there. Nobody moved it. The tarp is gone, blown away or stolen, and the foam boards she left inside have been knocked around by wind or animals. The mattress is still there, pushed against the wall, stained now with rain and mud and mold. It looks like a dumpster again. Just a dumpster. A big blue steel box behind a building that nobody's finishing. But Jolene knows what it was. For 10 months, in the worst year of her life, that steel box was the only thing between her and the ground. It was 8 feet wide and 22 feet long, and it had no roof, and no heat, and no address, and no landlord and nobody who cared whether she lived or died inside it. She made it work anyway, not because she was brave. She doesn't like when people say that. She wasn't being brave. She was being specific. She looked at a problem, and she measured the space, and she figured out what fit. A bed on the left, a stove on the right, room to walk between. That's all a home needs to be, if you strip everything else away. A place to sleep, a place to eat, and enough room to stand up. The dumpster was 8 feet wide. That was enough.